20, verses 24 and following. A passage that we briefly read this morning in our Bible class period, just a verse or two of it. But backing up to verse 24, we read, "Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, 'We have seen the Lord.' So he said to them, 'Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.' And after 8 days the disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, 'Peace to you.' Then he said to Thomas, 'Reach your finger here, and look at my hands.'" Verse 27. "And reach your hand here, and put it into my side. Do not, and yet have believed." We would be in the group of those who have not fixed our eyes literally on Jesus, and yet have, if we are Christians, believed in him. But Thomas was not the only doubting disciple. Sometimes we forget, maybe we've never read, the end of the mourned and wept because Jesus had died on the cross, and they did not know or did not yet believe that he had risen from the dead. Verse 11, "And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her," what does the text say? "They did not believe." They did not believe the women. And then you read that Mark goes on and says, "But they did not believe them either." And so the disciples, the apostles, not just Thomas, but the other apostles, they heard the women say that Jesus has risen from the dead. They didn't believe it. Two other disciples, again, seemingly those disciples on the road to Emmaus, came back as their words seemed like nonsense. They did not believe. And so when you go back to John chapter 20, and you hear Jesus say, "Do not be unbelieving, but believing," referring to Thomas or talking to Thomas. And then, though many use this passage that way. In fact, I was having a Bible study a few years ago, several years ago, I guess now, with a couple of Mormons. They referred to themselves, although they were in their late teens or early 20s, they referred to themselves as elders, not using that term, shepherd or elders, in a biblical New Testament way. And when we were talking about it honestly and critically, that the apostles should have believed without ever having to see Jesus. Why? Well, think about this. Think about how Jesus, as we talked about yesterday, he walked on water and they saw it. They saw him calm a storm. Imagine, being in the presence of one who could just will it or command it to be still. They saw him heal a man who had been born blind, raise a man who had been paralyzed. They saw him wither. Ephesians tells us in verses 21 and following that he would suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. And remember, Peter rebuked him for that, to which he said, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter didn't understand at that time what the plan of God was. So ask yourself this: why should the apostles, in fact, Jesus told them to go before him into Galilee. He was crucified down in Jerusalem. Why, before the passage we read, verse 19, "The same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews." So ask yourself this: why should the apostles have believed? Why should they have believed that Jesus was going to rise there at that moment in time? I'm not in any way. I'm suggesting to you when God says He's going to do something, He's going to do it. They should have believed Jesus because He said He was going to rise from the dead. And the judicial system of our proper beliefs being based upon credible testimony. Why do you believe that George Washington, I know I'm not in the United States of America, but my guess is you might know that he was the first president of the United States. Sorry, I don't know my Canadian history very well, okay? There was a man who once lived named Alexander the Great. It's just amazing to me. And so sad that there are some, not many, but there are some who will say that Jesus never lived. They don't have a problem believing that Alexander the Great was a real person, or that Julius Caesar was, or that Napoleon Bonaparte. They didn't follow him necessarily, but Pliny the Younger would say he was a real person. The Greek rhetorician Lucian believed that he was a real person. Early testimonies from even the Jewish historian Josephus, whom some say, well, I can commend various rulers or politicians or whatever that I might be in great disagreement with on many things, but I can say, he does seem, or she seems like a nice person. Seems like, someone who has good intent. People consider the case for the existence of God. Do you believe in God? Do I believe in God because I've literally seen Him with my eyes, or literally heard Him with my ears, or touched Him with my hands, or smelled Him, or tasted Him? No. So why do I believe that there is a God? Based upon credible testimony. In the daytime or the nighttime, whatever language you speak, wherever you are on this earth, there is adequate evidence. If there is such a thing as forensic science, someone can commit a crime and the police didn't see him commit the crime. Well, like this one right here on a beach somewhere, what are you going to conclude? That it just happened to appear out of nothing or nowhere? No, that it was someone made that, someone built that and placed that there. Well, what you have between your two ears is the most complicated matter, complex matter in the universe. Testifies that there is a creative belief in a world of so much unreasonable, mere emotionally based Christianity. We need to be able to reason about the resurrection of Jesus. I'm not suggesting to you that Christianity is not emotional. I'm not suggesting to you that we should not be, and particularly this morning, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Luke would open up the book of Acts with these words, "The former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach, until the day in which He was taken up, after He, through the Holy Spirit, had given commandments to the apostles whom He had chosen, by many infallible proofs." You remember in Luke chapter 24, the Bible tells us, going back to, after He appeared to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then they went and testified to the apostles. And then He says, "Have you any food here?" So they gave Him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and He took it and ate in their presence. Listen, if you want to ever know if someone who is dead has been raised from the dead, well, just have the most historically documented ancient book in the world. And there is anyone who is unbiased about the matter has to absolutely admit this. That when you think of history, and you think of there are some manuscripts of those books. But the number of those manuscripts and the age of those, the closer you get back to the original, the more you would think you should be able to trust that. And whether it be Josephus' Jewish of the New Testament, some manuscripts that go back to the very beginning of the 2nd century A.D., less than 100 years removed from the originals. The amount of, again, I am convinced that any unbiased scholar, even unbelievers, atheists, documented ancient book in all the world, that you will read repeated testimony of the resurrection of Jesus. Furthermore, though preventative steps were taken, Jesus' tomb was found empty, and there's simply no way to get around this. Not the Josephus that I was talking about, the Jewish historian a while ago. And if I have that name wrong, just left me a moment ago. It was Josephus, right? Who buried Jesus along with Nicodemus, who came to Jesus earlier in John chapter 3. That same passage that was read for us a moment ago before the contribution. Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 and following. The Bible says that the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, Matthew 27, 63, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was still alive how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days.'" By the way, isn't it interesting that after Jesus died on the cross, it was the enemies of Jesus who said he was going to rise when? On the 3rd day. I'm not saying they believed it without having seen it, but they remembered the prophecies that Jesus made. To the people, he is risen from the dead, so the last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go your way, make it as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting a guard. Now, 2 days later, when Peter and the apostles stood up on the day of Pentecost to preach, Jesus has risen from the dead, which was the cornerstone of that lesson, and which is the cornerstone of our faith, that he's risen from the dead. Do you realize that? And yet that's not what happened. And that's all that it would have taken to stop Christianity in its tracks. There was a letter that was passed around, issued by the Jewish Sanhedrin, that circulated early in the 1st century, mentioned by Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Trifo. When unfastened from the cross, and now deceived men by certainty is risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. So the very thing that the enemies of Jesus were trying to keep from happening supposedly happened. That, well, they just stole his body. That's what. And you ask yourself, well, how much sense does that make? Like, were people really going to believe this? Because if they knew where Jesus was buried, what would they have done? What do you think the Jewish chief priests and scribes and Pharisees? The resurrection of Jesus is confirmed by eyewitness testimony. And not just a little bit. Paul would write, as we read, I believe, briefly yesterday from 1 Corinthians 15, "I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received, that Christ rose." I mean, that's a lot of testimony, right? I mean, if you were to give these 500 witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus just 2 minutes apiece to testify in a trial, that's 1,000 minutes divided. Like the disciples whose fear changed to boldness. The apostles, you recall, when Jesus was arrested, the Bible tells us that they fled. They fled. They were afraid for their lives. The Bible would say they all forsook him, Mark 14, verse 50. Up and down. 1 minute he's cutting off the ear of the servant of the high priest, and the next he's denying Jesus 3 times. Even cursed. We just read from John 20 how the disciples, chapter 2, they're at the temple and they're preaching. They're preaching the death, burial, and resurrected men of Israel. Hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him. Verse 29, David, he's not dead and buried. Verse 31, he, foreseeing this, that is of Jesus' resurrection, spoke concerning the resurrection of the Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God has raised up. Imagine that. They go to get Acts chapter 5, verse 23. They go get the apostles they think are in their prison. And they say that the prison is shut securely and the guard stands it again. And they said, the high priest, did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? What are you doing? They said, Peter and the other apostles answered, said, we ought to obey God rather than men. You know, I've never been arrested for preaching the gospel. You know, we in the United States, and maybe you here in Canada, we are frustrated because we feel like some of our freedoms are not what they should be. The same confidence that even if we are threatened and beaten, we're going to depart like they did. Acts 5 verse 41, and rejoice that we were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily, maybe not in the temple, but in every they were willing to give their lives for Christ, and they did. Acts chapter 12, James the apostle was killed with Herod's sword. I mean, maybe it wasn't Herod literally, but it was a sword commanded by Herod to kill him. Fox's Book of Martyrs, historically, from that point forward. I mean, preaching, they boldly testified that Jesus physically rose from the dead throughout the book of Acts. Not to mention all their epistles throughout the New Testament. We've already read from Acts chapter 2. He's risen from the dead. In Thessalonica, he's risen from the dead. Before Festus said Agrippa. Just before Festus says, Paul, much learning is driving you mad, Paul had testified that Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. People can think we're crazy all they want. All they want, alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs being seen by them. There is great evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Unbeliever Joseph McCabe once wrote, Paul was absolutely convinced of the resurrection. And this proves that it was widely believed not many years after the death of Jesus. Opinion in his day, an opinion at that time supported by the highest authority imaginable, the eyewitnesses. I mean, friends, the apostles suffered and died because of their teachings about the resurrection. Paul is believed to have been beheaded. Peter and Andrew crucified. Thomas thrust through with the spear. They're not making money off this. They're not getting, rich and famous in a positive way for this, right? They weren't crazy, y'all. And what I mean is they weren't insane. And here's what I mean by that is the New Testament is the Bible and even New York Times best-selling books. So if they weren't insane, then they were either telling the truth or they were lying. Why would you lie and then say that liars, Revelation 20, and they believed it with the highest kind of evidence there is? They saw Jesus. And last, I would just say, it is interesting, is it not, that many thousands of Jews who were committed to observe priests became obedient to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Wow, what was it that convinced them? They came to, if they became Christians, they had to, early on there, become believers in the resurrection of Jesus. In the resurrection of Jesus. In Acts 21, we read that when Paul returned, the same Greek word, myriad, it's just transliterated there. It's not really translated, it's transliterated. But it's translated as 10,000 in Acts chapter 19. There were 10,000 pieces of silver in verse 19 of chapter 19. My point is, translators here say, that word means 10,000. And specifically there, it's 10,000. First day of the week, and 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 3, as the churches of Galatia have been commanded, so the churches at Corinth were to lay by in store on the first day of the week. Why that day? But just early Christians writing this, in his first apology, Justin Martyr noted how Christians would gather together on the day called Sunday to read the writings of the apostles and prophets, to instruct, to pray, give, and eat of bread and wine. Why do we do this on the first day of the week, brothers and sisters? We're all going to pass from this physical life. But we are guaranteed to live again through Jesus, who rose from the dead. Do you all normally have an invitation song, or do we close just with a problem? On March the 25th, 1987, I confessed the name of Jesus Christ, the resurrected Lord and God, on my way to becoming a Christian, being immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins. May God help us to turn away from sin, turn to God, become Christians. May God help us give Him